Let's take a look at how to solve the following quadratic equation using the square root property. We want to solve the equation -2 times the quantity x plus 5 squared minus 13 equals 11. Now, to employ the square root property, we want to isolate this quantity here, which is being raised to the second power. That means we want to move this -13 and this -2 to the right side. We need to use reverse operations to do that. So we want to get this by itself. The first thing we need to do is move this -13. So let's add 13 to both the left side of this equation and to the right side of this equation. That gives us, on the left, -2 times the quantity x plus 5 raised to the second power equals, on the right, 24. Now again, we're hoping to use the square root property to solve this equation, and to use that square root property, we want to isolate the x plus 5 squared, which means we want to get rid of this -2. Now the -2 is multiplied by that quantity, so we want to divide both sides by -2 to get rid of it on the left side. -2 divided by -2 is just 1, and that leaves us with x plus 5 quantity squared on the left side and -12 on the right side. Well, let's take a look. We now have a quantity squared on the left, so we're ready to use the square root property. But before doing so, check out that we have a negative number on this right side. This means the answers to our equation are going to be complex. That's because there's no real number we can put in here and add 5 and then square it and get a negative number. As we go through and use the square root property, let's keep this in mind. We're going to take the square root on both sides so we can get rid of this power of 2. So let's take the square root on the left side and the square root on the right side, remembering, of course, that there are actually both positive and negative square roots that make this equation true. The square root of x plus 5 squared is simply the quantity x plus 5. Plus or minus the square root of -12, well, we need to talk a little bit about that. We have the square root of a negative number, which we already said will not be real, but instead imaginary. And so off to the side, let's go ahead and simplify that. The square root of -12 can be thought of as the square root of -1 times 12. The square root of -1 is just I, and so we're going to have I times the square root of 12. But there's one more thing we can do, right? 12 can be broken down into factors of 4 and 3. And we can take a square root of 4. In fact, this expression, I times the square root of 12, can simplify farther to I, and then the square root of 4 is 2 times the square root of 3. This is what we'll need to use when we simplify this right side. So let's take a look. We have x plus 5 in a quantity. We really don't need those parentheses, right? So we just have x plus 5 on the right side equals plus or minus, and then we have 2i times the square root of 3 on the right side. We're not quite done. We're almost there. We're solving this quadratic equation for x, so we need to isolate x. The last step will be to get rid of the 5, so we're going to subtract 5. Now, when we subtract 5, it is not an imaginary number. Therefore, we cannot combine it here with the 2 and square root of 3. Instead, I'm going to place it in front of both the plus and minus, and so that tells me that I have x being two solutions. -5 plus 2i times the square root of 3, and -5 minus 2i times the square root of 3. Which, if you like, we could rewrite over here as x equals negative 5 plus 2, and I'm going to rewrite it as 2 times the square root of 3i, where I is outside the radical, or x is the solution negative 5 minus 2 times the square root of 3i. Those two answers satisfy this quadratic equation and make it true.